Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
This is Timothy Flanders, being a Catholic. This is the Terror of Demons morning show, reclaiming traditional Catholic masculinity. Joined as always by co-host Kennedy Hall. How you doing, brother?
Living the dream. How about you?
Doing excellent. Jesus is King. Hope everybody has a blessed Ascension Tide, a very important time of the year to raise our thoughts to heaven, to the kingdom of God. And in the midst of all of the insanity that we're dealing with, to remember that Jesus is King. He is seated on the throne. He's ascended his throne. And we beseech him for the gift of the Holy Spirit, especially for wisdom in navigating these dark waters. And we're going to talk about this period today, which is very relevant, especially when we don't know what to do, where we can remember our fathers who faced a world war where there was many sides to this conflict, and many situations where there were two choices to do, two choices to choose from, and both were bad. And this is what war is. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And I don't have let's make a calendar here. We've got all right. So the Sunday of the Ascension, today is Saint Paschal Baylon. We have Saint Peter Celestine, the resigned Pope, Saint Peter Celestine, back in 1296. Saint Bernardine of Siena, great reformer against the nascent capitalism of the Renaissance, and Saint Rita on Saturday, and Vigil of Pentecost. So Pentecost is coming. Do your novena to the Holy Spirit. That's about it. So today we're going to talk about the wrath of God, the World War II, the yet more terrible war that was prophesied by Fatima in response to the wickedness of man, the first sexual revolution that we talked about, the lack of repentance, in that this is the way that we need to understand what's going to happen. What's happening now is 1938 to 1945, the wrath of God. So this week we're going to talk about World War II, and then next week we'll talk about post-war 1945 to 1960, and then after that we'll talk about fake Sister Lucia. That'll be the debate on approximately May 31st, God willing, if all goes well. So I wanted to recommend, before we go into the topic, two texts that I have found very helpful. One is Christopher Dawson's book, The Judgment of the Nations. This was written in 1942 during the war, where Christopher Dawson reflects on the war and what led to the war. He has a chapter on the failure of liberalism and how liberalism, as we've discussed in this show, has failed, and the secularization of Western culture. And then the second section of the book is all about how do we rebuild Catholic order. And so this text is excellent because he understands that this is the judgment of the nations. This is the wrath of God, is what this is. Another important text, Puritan's Empire. Everyone needs to go buy Puritan's Empire by Cologne. Very important text as well. And I've used both of those texts. But the beginning of this, I wanted to start by giving a background to we had mentioned the building of the cathedrals of the Immaculate Conception. There was one in Moscow and one in Nagasaki, Japan. So, and that was around 1900. They were both the largest cathedrals in Asia. And Our Lady was basically creating these thrones to Christ, and sequestering Asia in the Immaculate Conception. And the Nagasaki Cathedral was built by the stalwart Japanese who had kept the faith for 200 years after they had lost all their priests. So they had no priests for 200 years, and they had finally, actually in 1854, which was when the Immaculate Conception was defined, shortly thereafter, they began building the Immaculate Conception Cathedral, which was built in Nagasaki. Nagasaki was the epicenter of Japanese Catholicism.
Mhm.
And obviously that is a crucial point that needs to be said before we begin World War II. There were some comments mentioning how in the 1930s, the Japanese Empire was beginning to invade China and other places. And they were already beginning earlier, because we had commented earlier about 1938 and how the war began when Hitler took Austria to take Dietrich von Hildebrand, public enemy number one, which fits with the prophecy of Fatima. But also, even before that, Japan was invading China and exerting its influence. That was also creating tensions with the United States and the American Empire. And the American Empire's interest was already, the American Empire had the Philippines. Yep. It had the Philippines since 1900, and the Philippines was in a process of Americanization through public schooling and re-education. So they were trying to de-Catholicize the Philippines for the past few generations. And we've had a few Filipino commenters who have also confirmed this as well from their perspective. So this was creating tensions already before in the 1930s. It was already tensions between the American Empire and the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. So this is the background to World War II that's happening in the background, while Europe is also descending into darkness. And I would say that the big key to World War II, to me, I think, is the pact between Stalin and Hitler that begins the whole war, because Stalin and Hitler make a pact, which is, according to Paul Johnson in Modern Times, he says that it's a simple aggression pact against Poland, which would allow the Soviets a stronger position than at any time since the regime came to power. So when Poland is invaded in 1939, the Nazis come in from the west and the Soviets come in from the east. And then we have the massacre of Katyn, which is when 25,000 Polish officers and other intellectuals and civilians were massacred by the Soviets. So we have this destruction of Poland from both sides by the Soviets and the Nazis. And that's what was happening in the very beginning. And that's when you have a young Karol Wojtyła, later Pope John Paul II. He was leading cultural resistance to the Nazis in Poland, but Poland very much was and continued to be, even after the war, the victim of really the first military and violent victim of this war. So those are some key points to begin. There's so many different things to go through.
You really, you see how it, again, World War II was like another nail in the coffin against Christendom as best as they could, taking out the strongholds, Poland sort of being that gateway to the East in Europe, which is so important for a lot of reasons. And even it's interesting to think about Japan. And it's funny, or it's sad that I've seen so many, let's say, conservative Catholic commentators try to defend the nuclear bomb. And I've never heard them mention the Catholic presence in Japan when they do so. And it's, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't the cathedral even the coordinates where they dropped the bomb, where they just decided to, because it was the tallest part in the city? I've heard that before. So there really is an anti-Catholic animus in the offense of all these different enemies, and which makes sense because, you know, if there is a demonic reality behind all this, it means that the fallen angels know exactly who to go after, which is the Catholic Church. So, and also too, I would say that the rumblings of World War II were already beginning in Spain. You know, because people have said that basically Spain itself was in or Europe itself was started in a civil war in 1936, in a sense, and with what happened with Franco. And they're, again, trying to establish the order of Christendom, the Catholic order of things, which they did, and actually did have a victory against the communists, which was rare. And that became a crucial neutrality point in the Second World War, which today liberal commentators love to use against anything Catholic or anything old world in the war, because Franco remained neutral, which meant that obviously Hitler and Mussolini and things like that could sort of use parts of Spain for ports and or gathering and things like that. So it really is. You see how the Second World War in a lot of ways is even a continuation of the First World War, where it's just this battle against Christendom, destroy any of the old order. And I've said this before, but I'll reiterate it, that Japan's such an interesting player in this, because obviously there was some craziness. Some of the way that some of the some of the things they did in China, for one, but some of the things that they did in their war tactics were obviously really nuts. However, Japan was an old world sort of nation. It represented sort of, antiquity in a sense. It had been in some ways, I mean, they technologically advanced a bit in the 1800s, but it had been in so many ways unchanged culturally. And it was against modernity in this, not technologically, but in the sense of morals and how they saw the world, which, even though they weren't Christian, they were against, let's say, the onslaught of liberalism. So they had to have a victory over another stronghold of antiquity.
Yeah. So the what you're saying, the Catholic powers are reacting, and they are, like in Franco's case, you have the Catholic powers reacting to the first sexual revolution and liberalism, and the microcosm of World War II happens in the Spanish Civil War, because the Soviets and the Americans side with the communists of Spain.
That's right.
And then on the other hand, the fascist powers and Hitler sides with the nationalists, the Franco regime. And so there's sort of a basic coalition that is based on the economic powers, the economic advantages. Mm-hmm. And what you just said, it's a continuation of World War I, because once again, like we discussed, World War I, the Allies punish Germany. Germany goes into economic disaster, which allows them to radicalize, because when God punishes the world with the 1920s sexual revolution, God punishes the world with the Great Depression. It punishes all the liberal democracies, rather, I should say. Yeah. Like we said, the corporatist economies are not as affected by the Great Depression. But in the 1930s, there is the Great Depression that punishes these liberal democracies for all of their the greed, basically, because their greed just catches up to them. And then ultimately, there's really no way out of the Great Depression except for World War II, just on a bare economic level, because they can't really figure out how to get rid of all these problems unless they unite the whole country in a war effort. And this is true in America. But it's the same continuation. It's the same fighting over just pure economic power. Just in the main players, whether that's Hitler, Stalin, America, Britain, we're just fighting over economic power. And that's why, once again, the papacy is neutral. Papacy is not taking sides. Once again, this is modern war. This is modern war where people are just fighting over economic interests. The elites are manipulating the masses into, this is a crusade for freedom. This is a crusade for liberation of evil, tyranny, whatever. But really, in reality, the common man is just trying to defend his village, his town, his nation from attack from another power, or they're conscripted. There's the mass conscriptions. People are forced into the army. So in Germany, and the 14-year-old Joseph Ratzinger is a seminarian. He gets forced into the Nazi anti-aircraft paramilitary. So he has to help out with this Nazi war effort. I mean, he's forced into it. And they're forcing seminarians into the army. I mean,
we can't stress enough, whenever you talk about Mustache Man, whenever you talk about Hitler, someone's going to watch this and say, oh, you were wrong on this, or you didn't push enough on this. I mean, he's one of the most complicated figures that you'll find, because he was truly like a mix of everything. So when we're trying to talk about this period of history, the narrative that we've been given from the sort of liberal education standpoint is obviously false, because it's just this black and white, allies were good, although they're probably going to rewrite that at some point because they can't stand believing anything that any country did was good. But it's too simplistic the way that we talk about World War II and all the characters involved, and Hitler's one of them. He's one of those complicated, very strange, almost eclectic mix of 50 different personalities and different, this is why some people will say he was a fascist. Why? Because some of the things he did were something like fascism, because he was a nationalist and so forth. But he called himself a socialist, which is why it was National Socialism. But he was also kind of, in a way, was he an atheist? Well, not really, because he was kind of a pagan pantheist, recapturing some sort of Aryan Viking something other. But on the other hand, he was very much a Darwinian. So he was all over the map, and a very complicated, kind of insane person, literally. You try to pin down what he was, no one really knows. And his posse of people that, as you said, Germany was completely destroyed after World War One. Not just from the war, but from the fallout of the having the reparations and things. So you can imagine in Germany at the time, this is a nationalist movement is what it was. But the nation itself was very schizophrenic, because is Germany trying to have a nationalist movement in the sense of its old Catholic roots, or is it trying to have a nationalist movement in the sense of its very anti-Catholic Reformation liberal roots, or is it trying to have a before World War One, they had a very Freemasonic leaning government and so forth. So the point is it in and of itself, Germany was confused, very confused. So the way that, in my opinion, they were able to mobilize a country in a nationalist effort was to make it a very uniquely German thing, which somehow would try to include all these competing ideas. Which means when you look in Hitler's, when you look in his posse, when you look in his group of people who advised him, some of them were full-on eugenicist, full-on, everything bad you could think, trying to recapture there was a huge pagan element, and it was very strange. On the other hand, there were people who were basically Catholics who were looking at this almost as Hitler being the strong man who could fight against sort of the encroachment of liberalism and allow us to establish a German identity, which would bring order and freedom for, the traditional morals and things all over the map. So as we're trying to discuss Hitler and these characters, to be objective about him is key, even if it's uncomfortable in some ways, because we can't stress enough how whitewashed the historical narrative has to be when we're told that America, Canada, Britain, so forth, we are like the second coming of Jesus Christ, when we were shaking hands with Stalin, who might be the greatest devil of the 20th century. Whereas on the other hand, you have some of the European powers who were backed into a corner geographically in a lot of ways, and were choosing to try and find a way to work with the crazy guy next door who they weren't really sure about. And also, a lot of the really harsh atrocities that we found out about, those things were not common knowledge. They weren't. And so, people think, oh, the Allies went to war to liberate people from the camps. No, they didn't. They went to war because it was a war and there were geopolitical reasons why they went in. And then they've used that sort of, they've used the concentration camps as a way to justify everything they ever did. But it wasn't that way at the beginning.
Yeah, it's difficult for everyone to know. This is what war is. We can look back on the war and we can see everything that was going on. And then we can say, well, you should have known X, Y, Z about what was going on. Mm-hmm. But in reality, they may or may not have known X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. It's just like when we talk about like people like John Paul II and the abuse crisis or whatever, or different popes, like we talked about Pius XI, did he really know everything about Fatima, or was there just all this bureaucracy? There's just no way to know for sure.
That's right.
And so we need to just try to give everybody a sympathetic reading if we can. But what Hitler does is he basically, he gets a following because there's so many different factors going on. It's certainly just not like there's the devil and everyone follows the devil. Because like you said, people didn't know exactly what was going on in terms of the mass murder of Jews and other enemies that he had desired to kill, especially with his eugenics pagan ideology. And so people were following Hitler because he was actually providing an economic defense for the German people against encroachments by the Allied powers since World War I. So they're following after him and saying that. Now, Dietrich von Hildebrand, as we noted, and other Catholics understood better. They were able to see through what Hitler was doing. They were able to see through all of his rhetoric and understand that he was basically a pagan who was actually attacking the Catholic Church. And as we said, Hitler was only using the Catholic Church as long as the Catholic Church went along with him. And as soon as the Catholic Church realized and started to oppose him more directly, he then started to eradicate the Catholic Church. Hundreds of priests were killed in the concentration camps. Of course, our favorite, Maximilian Kolbe,
that's right,
who was, and once again, that we just need to stress here because of the false history that gets written after World War II, which is basically that the Catholic Church didn't care for Jews. They just kind of liked Hitler because the Catholic Church is anti-Semitic. That's completely false. The record is very good with the Catholic Church in World War II. The priests and our priests and Catholics all over the place are defending Jews. Pius XII is spending millions trying to get Jews away from Hitler. He's sheltering Jews in Rome. And then we have Maximilian Kolbe, who's helping the Jews in Poland, and he's sheltering them. And then he goes to the concentration camp and gives his life over for someone else. So that's what really happens. And this false history is going to have a large role to play in the post-war world and at Vatican II.
Yep.
So I want to talk about France. Do you want to mention Italy? What's up with Italy?
Well, Italy right now was in their, they had their leader, Mussolini, who we've talked about a little bit, and he's obviously one of those characters who's vilified maliciously by liberals. But he had a tacit relationship with Germany. And if anyone can look at a map, Italy is surrounded by France, Switzerland, and Austria on the borders. But once Austria becomes part of this German empire, that means Italy is surrounded by Germany. And Switzerland always remained neutral. Eventually, France was taken over, or at least basically taken over, which meant Italy was basically surrounded by the German Empire, at least their powers. So, and again, Mussolini was an anti-Marxist. He was against socialism. He was against communism. He was against all these things. And if you were to survey the geopolitical powers at the time, the Germans were, especially considering they're actually your neighbor, they were let's put it this way. You could have a hesitant relationship with them because in theory, you dislike the same people more or less. So you could assume that perhaps they would be an ally in helping you to keep your nation free from Marxist influence. So that was what Italy's position basically was, as far as World War II is concerned. And also, Italy had been helping out Spain in their civil war, and so did Germany. They had sent some help as well. So there was sort of this kind of working relationship between Italy and Germany. And again, to reiterate, it was a hesitant relationship. Mussolini did not like admire Hitler or something like that. And people will find these videos of Mussolini is like shaking hands or laughing or something with Hitler. Have you ever watched a G8 summit or a G7? I mean, like, you've got people that lead countries go to talk to other people that lead countries, and then they're probably just kind of polite with them when they see them. That's just kind of what people do out of courtesy. I mean, I remember when Trump was making jokes with, what's his name, the North Korean guy, and everyone was like, "Oh, look, he's he's just like a North Korean." It's like they're at a meeting and they're gonna have like a drink and they're gonna make like he's just gonna be. Anyway, that's what people do when they meet. They try to be nice to each other. But Mussolini himself never took Hitler seriously because, again, Mussolini was was philosophically a corporatist. Okay, he was trying to enact in some way the economic tenets that had been laid out in the various social encyclicals that were given to him by his advisors and so forth. And Hitler was not that. His economics were strange. So he was just sort of a reluctant neighbor. I kind of look at it like, if you look at your neighborhood and you've got people who are of all different varying beliefs, but you kind of say, well, we both don't like the government. So do you want to sort of, it's kind of like in this anti-lockdown stuff. You've got some very strange bedfellows. A lot of the people here are Christians who are against it, but also a lot of them are like New Age and so forth. And they've got a lot of wacky ideas. However, in a time of, let's say, persecution, you have to sort of hedge your bets and say, can we work together against this common enemy? But there's always a risk. There's always a risk. And I just wrote an article for Crisis about, a lot of the skepticism about the injection. We'll call it that. There's a lot of reasons to be, obviously, and 100% I support that. But it's been co-opted by a really strong New Age contingency, sort of a New Age conspiracy contingency, and it almost seems very Gnostic. And that's, in my opinion, getting a lot of Catholics sort of wrapped up in things that they need to be careful of. But that's always the risk of working with people who have strange ideas, but are against the same enemy as you. And I think that's sort of what ends up. Italy didn't have much of a choice either. They really didn't. They had no choice but to deal. I mean, if they were going to say no to America, no to the Allies, and then also Germany, thumb their nose at them, I mean, they'd be blown off the map. So that was sort of the deal that Mussolini had to try to make.
Right. So we have the mass murderer of Stalin, who's a madman, who is already forced starving the Ukrainians, thousands of them in the 1930s. It
was like 6 million or something.
I don't know.
I don't know how much.
Yeah, the Holodomor. I'm not sure the actual number on that, but
I think it was massive.
But once again, we don't know how much people knew at the time. So to be fair to all sides, we didn't know. I mean, Americans and British ally with Stalin, did they really know how bad Stalin was? I'm not sure. He was going on for a lot longer, of course, so they knew what the Soviet Union was all about for decades. Yeah. Did people know what Hitler was all about? They had an idea. Did they know everything? No.
It's about 4 million, by the way. I just looked it up.
Okay. So we've got a mass murder on both sides of this war. We've got Stalin on one hand. We've got Hitler on the other. Who's worse? Who knows? We're not going to make a call. But the point is, this is the punishment from God. God sends the punishment, and this is the time for repentance. Yeah, the time for all of us to repent and turn to the cross. I'll find this quote when you're talking sometime. There's here it is. This is what Dawson says in 1942 on Judgment of the Nations, page 106. He says, everything depends on whether it is possible to use the temporal struggle not for the destructive or purely material ends, but as a means of checking the demonic forces that have been let loose in the world. Mm-hmm. And this is what Dawson observes, is that we have just imperial forces trying to remake the world in their image according to their gospel. And we need to understand that there are demonic forces at play here. Now, I want to ask you about, Kennedy, about Marxists and Masonic demonic forces in just a second. We can talk about France first, and we'll talk about that, and we talk about Japan. So France is the key player for the history, because France, as we said before, is sort of the trending nation of Europe. What is French is what is cool, and it's been that way for centuries. And so in France, we already talked about in the 1920s and 30s, there's this generational shift that's happening where there is a rising younger generation of theologians in the church who are much more amenable to the left-wing causes, to the communists, and they're trying to sort of play ball with them. There's going to be this movement called the worker priests that's going to happen, where you have priests that are going to go and get a job at a factory to try to relate to the factory workers, but is also going to be very influenced by communism. Mm-hmm. And so you have this younger generation arising, which is breaking apart with the older generation of Frenchmen and French clergy, which is also tied up with the political struggles, as we've discussed them, between the monarchists of the French monarchists and the French Republicans. And that's been going on for generations at this point, since 1789. And then there was the condemnation of Action Française in 1926 or 7. So this is dividing the French church.
Yep.
And then what happens is there's so many different, there's these little communist revolutionaries happening in the 1930s and 20s and 30s. France is divided, very divided. So when Hitler takes France, he's able to take France very easily. France is very internally divided. They can't put up a fight. So France is on its knees, and it has nothing to do. So then France, once again, is further divided between two figures, Pétain and de Gaulle. Mm-hmm. And Pétain, he founds Vichy France in the south of France, which is where he makes a deal with Hitler to keep self-rule in France, where this is where a lot of Catholics and traditionalists rally to Pétain in the south of France to create a corporate Catholic-ish state in the south of France. And this is where one of the two key French players in the French church, who are Garrigou-Lagrange and Jacques Maritain, they part ways at this point because they divide. They used to be united under Action Française. They're now divided on this question because Garrigou-Lagrange says everyone must support Vichy France is the only way to save France. Basically, we have to play ball with Hitler. We don't have a choice. We have to allow this and basically kind of try to keep a neutrality with the war is the effort that they wanted to do. They wanted to have neutrality to an extent, but you're just dealing with all these devils. So what do you do with these devils on both sides trying to take your land, take your people? They tried their best. And so Pétain takes Vichy France, and Vichy France is much more of a Catholic corporatist state. And then de Gaulle, he rallies the Frenchmen to what he calls Free France, which is the liberal democracy Republican France, which is, of course, supported by the Allies. And so you have France who's kind of in the middle again, just like Spain was. France is now in the middle of this war where France is being pulled with the Axis. It's being pulled with the Allies. And this is a microcosm of Vatican II because the French church, because of this generational shift, the French church is shifting away from the old ways. Like you said, it's the shedding of the old ways, the old order. And the influence of France is being given over to all of the new left-wing liberal Frenchmen, French clergy, who are into the new ways and the new French Republic and the new Free France. And this is what's going to happen as the Allies win and their influence begins to write the history and write the influence. And that's going to happen to France as well as in Germany. It's going to be a similar thing that the sort of the secular left, the secular liberals are able to take over in the church and society in France and Germany. And that's going to set up Vatican II.
It's funny. Cardinal Suinens, I think they said Vatican II was the French Revolution in the church. But I think we could also say it's more like a civil war within the church, which I guess French Revolution kind of was. But it's the parallels that you make between, the parallels that you make between the Second World War and how that affected Vatican II are exactly that. You can't underestimate the effect. And I can't remember I heard this before, but basically talking about a man like Ratzinger, who, he's such a complicated figure because on the one hand, I've heard the best explanation of him I heard was he had incredible hardware, but just not the right software. Like it's clearly he's extremely smart. Clearly he's, one of the greatest geniuses we've had as far as like an intellectual output is concerned. Whether you agree with his positions or not, they're argued with great German precision. Let's put it that way. And, but he himself waxes and wanes in his sort of modernist leaning and traditionalist leaning back and forth over the last few decades. But when they talk about the psychological effect that the Second World War had on Europeans, Vatican II was almost, they were just tired of negativity. They just couldn't handle this idea that there was too serious of business to deal with because they had been steeped in that since World War I and through the Second World War. And if you you think, how on earth could you have a council where you basically as a whole would say we're in this new progressive modern era where modern man is realizing what is it? Which is it? One of the documents, is it Gaudium et Spes or Lumen Gentium, where it's like modern man is becoming more aware of his morality or something like that. And I'm thinking, how on earth could you think that after what you've just been through for the last 40 years? But in a sense, I mean, if we can psychologize it for a second, it really is. It's kind of like a defense mechanism. I mean, if you've gone through an insanely difficult childhood, your options are basically, will I become sort of some negative drunk, or will I just be someone who's all about like positivity and self-affirmation, just make myself feel good? There really is a massive effect on the psychology of the theologians going into that. And you can see that because also as well, you had seen, let's say, we can look back now and we can look at men like Franco and Mussolini and Petain, these different men, and we can say, you know what, they were standing against liberalism, technically speaking. They were giving us they were giving us a Catholic structure, let's put it that way. But it's a very severe reality, and it requires a military, it requires austerity, it requires a lot of struggle. I mean, and it was hard enough at that time when there was still a vestige of Christendom. Whereas you look at how can you understand the place of the church in the world in the 1960s, all of that stuff had been destroyed. And I think the prospect, this is just my opinion, but the prospect of trying to recapture the spirit of a Franco or Mussolini or one of these men would just give you nightmares, considering what you had to go through when you actually had them around and how severely they were persecuted. So it really is, the psychology of World War II might be the most important effect of it, is the generations to follow.
Yeah, there's so many important effects that happen deep within the psyche of the common man, because of World War II. And so we'll talk about that next week in much more detail, which goes into Vatican II, because there is actually a truth to some of what's being said in terms of human dignity when you come out of the war.
Yeah.
And so it's a mixture. It's this half truth on one side and half truth on the other, and chaos and ideologies and all sorts of things. So, but before we get into America enters the war, what are your thoughts on the Marxist Masonic dialectic with the demons, Kennedy?
Yeah. So this is a little thing I've been thinking about recently. Because I tweeted something a little while ago and I said, as Twitter is a place for the most intellectual thought in the world happens.
Yes.
And, but I just thought, I looked around and I said, man, it looks like we're going through a war between the Marxists and the Freemasons. And just like the Cold War. And that's my opinion. And Charles Coulomb liked it, which means it's historically true. But the reason I said that was because I've still been trying to make sense of this Trump thing. This whole populist movement thing, because anyway, I know that Trump was obviously not some sort of Catholic figure, but he definitely, in my opinion, wasn't a Marxist. So what was his orientation? Well, and then why have we had this clear Marxist takeover of the world, which is obvious? I've looked at the history I'm trying to understand the last 150, 180 years or so. And I said, and one of the responses to this message I put out was, no, Marxists and Freemasons are the same. And I thought, I don't think they are, even though I know they have common origins, because I mean, it's like sin. All sin is ultimately from a common origin, but we know we have different demons. And one of the things I learned when I was writing Family Be Damned, from reading Exorcist stuff, was demons don't actually have unity of purpose. They just have a utilitarian unity of action if it's common to both of them. But there you go. But you can't
purchase or copy today.
Yes.
While supplies last.
Exactly. Call now, act now. You can't ascribe. This is one thing, you can't ascribe virtue to demons because I don't think they're capable of it. So in the same way, Marxism and Freemasonry, they might have a similar origin, and we see that with the mixes. Friedrich Engels was a Freemason, and they're back and forth. But basically, at the end of the day, Marxism and Freemasonry are anti-Catholic sentiments. They're demonic, okay? But they play, in my opinion, on the temperaments of different people. So this is why America really is. I know people say it's a Marxist nation. Yes, there's lots of Marxism there, but if Freemasonry was just Marxism, then the Marxists wouldn't have had to try to infiltrate America, because it would have already been Marxist. You see what I'm saying? And so, is America anti-Catholic in its origins? Of course it is, but it's a different. The devil's always playing a different temperament of a person or of a group. So, American Freemasonry is one of it's the prosperity gospel. It's a positivity. It's we're going to get off the shekels of the old world. It's really a sort of mentality against austerity, against having to be virtuous in a sense, because it's this wild, untamed wilderness. You can be like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and sort of go out there and be your true self. You can tame the wild, and you can be at one with it, and you can have riches and beyond your wildest dreams, and you can go to Hollywood. Like, that's the Freemasonic mentality of the American dream. It's a very positive, happy sort of dream. Whereas on the other hand, the anti-Catholic animus in France, was it Freemasonic? Yes. But the thing about France and Europe in general is that Europe already had an established order that was very severe. So this is why in the West, like in the far West, in America and Canada, you see a Freemasonic society par excellence, because you're kind of starting from scratch. Whereas in Europe and Eastern Europe especially, what you see is an already established order, a completely established Christendom. So that anti-Catholic sentiment that might start with Freemasonry becomes Marxism, because you have to almost retrofit a society with a strong hand to have this ape of the church. So in my opinion, the dialectic between the Freemasons and the Marxists has been a war of theirs that we've seen played out, because at the end of the day, Marxists and Freemasons, again, do they have a common origin? Well, sure, but they're like rival street gangs. It's like, sure, you might come together to go after the police, but as soon as you've taken them out, you kind of just want dominance over your turf. That's how criminals always work. So when I look at World War I, and I think about the various players involved there, I see it more played out in World War II, where, again, do Americans and the Freemasonic Empire of America, does it come together with the Marxist Empire of the Soviets? They do, for a time, to beat out their common enemy, which is this establishment of the old order. But then what happens as soon as the Second World War is finished? Well, then you have the Cold War, which it's not that simple, but it really was a conflict. And there was always this, I mean, how could it get to the point where you were worried that you were going to get blown off the map by a nuclear bomb if both of these empires were apparently on the same page? They weren't, in my opinion. Okay. And so we've seen this play out more recently as well, where in my opinion, this is another instantiation of what happened, where these populist movements over the last, however many years, 6-7 years, they've really just been Freemasonic movements, if you think about it, because they've been movements about this sort of amorphous freedom, which is more desirable than Marxism, but it's still an error. And so I think, just to sort of round it out, Donald Trump was kind of an embodiment of that Freemasonic spirit, because really he was just arguing for some sort of idea of the American Constitution, which is Freemasonic. And in my opinion, that's why the hammer had to come down, because if it really, I believe it is a war between the Freemasons and the Marxists for dominance over this fallen world. And that's why, in a real sense, that Marxist, think of the groups involved in trying to destroy America last summer. They called themselves trained Marxists. They had to go against this populist movement, which was really Freemasonic, which wrapped up Christians, because at least it had this idea of the freedom to have God and country. Anyway, that's why I look at World War II and the fallout from there as a dialectic between the two. And then we do see that play out in the church, because on the one hand, we have the actual sort of communist infiltration of the council, where you can't even, like the Russian Soviet plant KGB sort of bishops come, and you can't actually condemn communism. But on the other hand, you have this reaction, which is personified in men like Pope John Paul II. And I know he's more complicated, but this freedom of religion, which is this hallmark of Freemasonry, really starts to come up. And I know you can interpret it differently, and you and I talked about that. But that becomes a dialectic in the church, where you basically have the, let's say, leftist Catholicism, which is like the actual, liberation gospel, or whatever it's called. What do you call that from Latin America?
Yeah, liberation
theology. Yeah, not gospel, which is really just Marxism. But on the other hand, you have the Ratzingerian sort of neoconservative, which is kind of Freemasonic adjacent insofar as it exalts the freedom of a man's conscience to sort of decide things for himself. So anyway, I think you see that played out in the time leading up to the Second World War, and I think you see that played out in the war as an actual conflict, and then I think you see the fallout of that in the church and in the Cold War.
Yeah, I think that's it's insightful, especially as it regards the church, because there is this false right and left Catholicism, which is just a false dichotomy, because they're just both playing on these half truths on both sides, and the integral Catholic consciousness is against both of those.
Well, you see that with true traditionalism in the good sense. It's neither capitalist nor Marxist, because both of them are errors. Whereas the George Weigel types represent, like, let's say, the conservative right-wing Catholicism, but really they're just George Bush devotees who are Catholic. Whereas, James Martin's on the left, or whatever stupid figure you pick, it's wrong. It's false. This is why, again, look at why is it that both the neocon sort of Protestant mentality of North America can jump on these anti-Catholic myths about Pope Pius XII or something as being Hitler's Pope or whatever. The point is they can pick up these lies from the Marxists, because they're both ultimately anti-Catholic spirits. And the left can look at the Catholic Church and discredit them. Whereas truly, the only one who can be objective about the Second World War is the man who looks at it through the lens of a traditional, I mean this in the good sense, not just in the aesthetic, but a theologically traditional, grounded Catholic mind can look at the Second World War objectively and say, the war itself was unjust. Like, it in and of itself was not a just war, full stop. Once it's called, the various players then had to decide prudentially what would their involvement be out of necessity for self-defense for their community and for their culture. Yes. And from there, you have to judge the various. This is why, again, you can't look at the Germans in this black and white sense. And you can't look at the Italians that way. You can't even look at the Japanese that way. But also, many great war heroes in Canada, they were fighting for a Freemasonic empire, but they were conscripted in. And then once they were there, they did very heroic things, individually taken against an enemy they were forced to fight against.
Yes.
That movie, it's a silly movie, but anyway, love Mel, the Patriot. It's a silly movie. It's historically wrong, but I don't care because it's awesome. And, but there's an interesting dialogue in the beginning where he basically says, I'm not going to war. He says, what's the point of having one tyrant across the sea or 3,000 tyrants as my neighbor? And they kind of laugh. And he's like, a democracy can take away your rights as much as a king. Actually, it's true. But then when he finally decides to go into the war, they're like, well, what changed? And he said, well, it came to my backyard. I had to. And that's the reality. And then at that point, you see the heroism of unique persons in it who have to fight. And then you have to look at their involvement almost in the same lens as you say what counts as self-defense and what counts as murder. There's a difference between them. However you got there, it's not the point. You're there now. And that's why World War II is so complicated.
Yeah, I think that right there really sums up the what we need to have the true perspective on this, because on the one hand, it's the wrath of God, it's the judgment of the nations, it's these empires conscripting and propagandizing, maybe manipulating the populace into their crusade for whatever moral good they think this is all about. And then you have the individual families who are just trying to make it by and trying to defend themselves or defend their places or their communities or whatever it may be. And then they are doing acts of heroism. I mean, the heroes really, we would just talk about the day-to-day heroes are these soldiers who are forced into a situation, and they do acts of heroism and courage on the battlefield, even though they're forced into a situation they don't want and they didn't ask for. And the cause overall may be unjust, but this very situation that they're dealing with is a just cause in the sense of trying to defend themselves or defend their brother in arms or whatever, these types of things. And that happens on all different sides of this whole conflict.
And it happens today.
Yeah. And so that's why we always need to emphasize, we need to give respect to servicemen, because they are giving their lives for something, and it may be complicated in all sorts of ways, but on the individual level, there's a great heroism. And speaking of heroism, I wanted to just mention before we talk about Japan and wrap up here, Saint Teresa Benedicta, the great Jewish convert to Catholicism, the philosopher. So she's a German, and then she sees what's going on with Hitler. She leaves because she's concerned that they're going to come to her convent and take everybody else as well. So by her presence, she's threatening the lives of her sisters. So she goes to the Netherlands, and she's in the Netherlands, but the Nazis take Netherlands, and the bishops, to their credit, and the Dutch bishops in the Netherlands. But this is the kind of situation we're talking about. The Dutch bishops in the Netherlands, they renounce Hitler. So we're forced with the situation. Do we renounce Hitler and then everyone gets killed publicly, or do we try to figure out how to peacefully coexist and resist in another way, which is helping more people be alive and not asking all the faithful to endure martyrdom? That's the choice. It's like
it's
between
like the Romans,
martyrdom or
Christians.
Yeah. So anyway, so Saint Teresa is in the Netherlands, and she writes her last testament, and she says this because she knows they're going to take over and take her. She says this: I joyfully accept in advance the death God has appointed for me, in perfect submission to his most holy will. May the Lord accept my life and the death for the honor and glory of his name, for the needs of his holy church, for the Jewish people, that the Lord may be received by his own, and his kingdom come in glory, for the deliverance of Germany and peace throughout the world, and finally for all my relatives living and dead, all of whom God has given me, may none of them be lost. So she is taken over with her sister to Auschwitz, and witnesses reported her serene calm and spirit of prayer and resignation to her fate.
Yeah.
And she arrived at the gas chambers and was immediately gassed and won the glorious crown. So Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, pray for us. A glorious martyr with Saint Maximilian Kolbe and many other saints and martyrs in this time.
And Saint Maximilian Kolbe, he's been watered down because he himself is a very politically incorrect saint, because he represents this. He is like a microcosm of the church and the balance the church gives us between the errors of the world and staying steadfast against them. So Maximilian Kolbe fought against Freemasonry. That was like his main goal. He also ended up fighting against Marxism. But again, they were different enemies that he had to fight against in different ways. But also, how should I say this? Sometimes the traditional Catholics will look at the E. Michael Jones position of the, let's say, international Zionist conspiracy, okay? And then we can't have any balance with the way that we look at that either, and we start doing the whole genetic fallacy of just looking at a group of people and applying all the same characteristics, which is not, it's not fair no matter who you do it to, because you're just going to be wrong. But Maximilian Kolbe, he himself did outreach to the Freemasons, he himself did outreach to the Marxists, and he himself did outreach to the Jews. So he understood all of those groups intimately, and he understood their interplay in this struggle for dominance in Western Europe at the time. So it's so interesting that he is, you know, like if you read some of his writings, you know, you put him in and they call him the Saint of Auschwitz. Yeah, he was, but he also was calling out a lot of errors of politically incorrect ways. Let's put it that way. But again, he himself, as a Catholic, is looking at everything going on in Europe and saying, problem here, problem there, problem there. I can't whitewash any group. I can't whitewash any ideology because all of them are competing for dominance. Which is why he had to be martyred, because he was, again, he was a microcosm of this spirit of Christendom that would stand against the errors of liberalism. So, and also he was a Mariologist par excellence and probably should be a doctor of the church one day with what he wrote about the Immaculata. But anyway, so he's the, and Saint Teresa Benedicta, they're perfect martyrs. I mean, if you want to understand the church's position against all these errors, sort of just read their lives and what they wrote, and you'll go, oh yeah, that's exactly against everything.
Yeah, this is so exactly. I agreed on all points. So Saint Maximilian Kolbe actually went to Nagasaki because the Pope was asking for missionaries to East Asia. Exactly. And in fact, he went to Nagasaki. That's the Catholic center of Japan. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to read from, so this is my newest book, which will be
got your copy already,
published. Nice. Yeah. Well, this is the review copy that I sent you. Did you get your copy yet that I sent? Did you get it?
I
Come in the mail?
Today.
Okay.
By Friday, it wasn't here.
Oh, okay. Well, it should be coming. So this is going to be from my newest book that'll be published later this year.
Can't wait to read it.
So some of these. So August 9, 1945. This was Catholics at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Nagasaki. No doubt some of these Japanese Catholics had been converted or benefited from St. Maximilian's labors there. Mary, as throne of Christ in Japan, reached for the sky, pointing men to lift up their hearts to the Father in heaven. But out of that sky came an object. Small at first, it quickly gained speed, and then everything was flame. The American Empire detonated the atomic bomb 500 meters away from the cathedral, destroying the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception and killing everyone. In all, the two bombs killed upwards of 200,000 Japanese men, women, and children. Those who were not instantly killed heard the shrieks of children half burned, their mothers dead. Japanese mothers suffered a high percentage of neonatal and infantile deaths as the radiation caused mental disorders for the unborn children exposed near the blast as they grew up over the next generation. The voluntarist buildup of militarism from Oliver Cromwell had finally reached the zenith of technological power. The use of this ultimate weapon to massacre tens of thousands of civilians was the glory of the American Empire, which surpassed in one moment the most horrific mass murdering that Hitler and Stalin had ever done in one act.
Yep.
But for Teilhard de Chardin, the progress of humanity in the invention of nuclear weapons matters more to him than the destruction of innumerable lives and the most terrible sufferings inflicted on individual persons. That's quoting Dietrich von Hildebrand's critique of Teilhard de Chardin and how Teilhard de Chardin views this event. So, in all fairness, obviously the American Empire did not kill as many unarmed civilians as Hitler and Stalin, sort of on a grand scale, but in this one act itself, Hitler and Stalin never were able to kill 200,000 civilians in one dropping of bombs.
It was indicative of a larger theme.
So, lamentably, we still have people today, even Catholics, who are defending the dropping of the atomic bomb as some sort of utilitarian thing in wartime where, well, let's just kill all of these innocent civilians to end the war, because otherwise more lives would have been lost if we invaded mainland Japan. Well, that's like saying, I think it's Dostoevsky when he says, if you could save the world just by torturing one little child. It's just the same thing. This is one single person is of infinite value. So even if we just say we're going to save the whole world just by torturing this one individual person who's innocent, that's still wrong, because an individual person is of infinite value.
And we're living through that today. And I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, about this stupid lockdown, the gift that keeps on giving. And they said, well, the mind of a lot of these people is I'll give up 1 year of my freedoms or whatever, because they, so I can have 10 more Christmases if I'm 70 years old or whatever. And it's like, you don't get it. You don't get to decide that you're going to ruin other people's lives intentionally at the off chance that you might accidentally die. You can't do that. So,
just say that again.
You can't make the decision to intentionally ruin other people's lives, which will happen at the off chance that you might accidentally die in another way. So the lockdown, sure, let's just say it's plague. And I know I keep talking about this, but I'm living in lockdown utopia. So, but that's the mentality. You watch the news and it's like, well, I haven't seen my grandkids in a year and a half, but you know what? I gave up these birthdays and whatever, so I could have 10 more with them. Well, for one, you don't know you're going to have 10 more because you might die tomorrow of heart failure or something. But secondly, the way that this is the mentality of that World War II utilitarianism played out today in the children who were raised by the World War II generation. These are the boomers who are in charge right now. And this is exactly how they think. Because they look at it and they go, well, basically, I'll sacrifice small businesses. I'll sacrifice a year of education for children. I'll sacrifice the children, basically, in a metaphorical sense, so that we can have 20 more years of prosperity. Ultimately, utilitarianism is a pagan mindset, because in the past it was explicit, where we'll literally sacrifice the children to the gods in a blood sense so that we can have a crop yield and appease the gods. Now it's, well, we'll sacrifice the structures of our society that will harm the children more than the grown-ups, but that's okay because we'll have 20 more years of prosperity. And this is the same mentality you have with the Second World War with the bomb. Sure, there would have been, I mean, theoretically, if you take the narrative at face value, there would have been the war might have continued in the East. Okay, but again, you're taking away the agency of people to make decisions justly about what they ought to do by saying we're going to just destroy this mass of civilians to end so we can hypothetically end what might come forward. You can't do that. You can't do that. It's exactly what Dostoevsky said. You're right. Will you torture a child? And unfortunately, when you go, I mean, I never liked philosophy in university because it was dumb the way that it was taught. And the one course I remember was basically they told us in life you had a choice between deontological perspectives and utilitarian perspectives, and that was it. And you realize, well, that's just nonsense as well. And the utilitarian perspective is the ruler of the day.
Yes. Now, somebody just mentioned in the chat here, American Empire entered the war December 8th, 1941, because the Pearl Harbor attack was December 7th, Feast of St. Ambrose, 41. And then it ends with the destruction of the Immaculate Conception Cathedral in Nagasaki. I never made that connection.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So thank you for that. Well, so that is the wrath of God. And this is what really starts the post-war world that we're living in, is this war. And Pius XII in 1944 gives an explicit approval for democracy. It's actually Pius XII who turns the church into an American-friendly institution. It's Pius XII. And so we'll talk more about that next week. Pius XII, post-war world, going into Vatican II. And I think really dig into what was going through people's heads after World War II. And we're going to talk about these half-truths that are on all sides and how there are these motivating factors, and try to really sympathetically understand what's going to happen when our fathers face the post-war world. And it's difficult for us to understand a few generations removed, but critical for understanding what happens at Vatican II and after. And all of this, Fatima, once again, called men to repent back in 1917. Men did not repent, so a greater and more terrible war was the result as the wrath of God.
Yep.
Any final words, Kennedy?
I think that's it. I think that's good enough for now.
All right. Well, let's offer up a Pater Noster for the end of Ascension Tide, and remembering that the Holy Spirit is coming on Pentecost to take us through the rest of the year. So let's offer this up for all of your intentions, and we especially pray for all the Catholics in the countries that we've discussed in this episode: America, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster, qui es cedis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniet regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Jesus is King.